This video is going to focus on the sheep eye, and typically if you were to do this dissection in your classroom, the sheep eyes would have a lot more fat and muscle surrounding it and covering it, and I just want to show you one that has not been cleaned, that it's kind of hard to see anything because a lot of the time the eyelids get folded over, and that dark thing that you can see in there, that is actually the cornea. So I've already cleaned up the one that we're going to work with, and the eye is divided into these things called tunics, and basically it just means a layer of the eye. The most outer layer is called the fibrous tunic. It's made up of connective tissue that has a lot of fiber, and it's a very rigid structure, hard structure. It helps to protect the eye, and it also gives the eye some of its shape. And the white portion in the posterior part of the eye is called the sclera, and that is continuous with the cornea, which is this region right here. The cornea actually is transparent, and this is where the light rays first try to enter the eye, and the refractory process of bending light rays starts with the cornea. So the other structure we can see externally is the optic nerve that is coming off the posterior portion of the eye. This nerve is cranial nerve number 2, and it is taking the axons from the photoreceptors to the visual processing center in the brain, which includes the corpora quadrigemina, that superior colliculi we learned about in the sheep brain dissection. That's where the visual reflexes are processed. So the next portion is we want to actually look at the internal components of the sheep eye. And to do that, I want to separate this into an anterior section and a posterior section. So I'm going to be doing a frontal cut, and to get through the sclera you need a very sharp pair of scissors, or you need a sharp razor blade, and I'm basically just cutting 1 centimeter behind the cornea. And as I'm doing this, there is fluid inside the eye. That fluid inside the eye serves a couple different purposes, one of which is to maintain the shape of the eye. The other is to continue to bend the light. So as I'm working my way around, you'll see that we have separated this into an anterior and a posterior portion. And as I did that, the lens actually came loose. So I'm going to set the lens down here and make sure that we can focus on it for a moment. The lens is, it reminds me of a marble because of how hard it is, but this is actually flexible, and it helps with near point accommodation when you're trying to see things up close. And if you're trying to see things further away, it stretches out more. So there is some flexibility to it. You can also see that there is this gelatin material that's attached to it. This is called the vitreous humor. This is part of the posterior segment of the eye. The posterior segment is anything posterior to the lens. The anterior segment would be anything anterior to the lens. The additional liquid you see on my dissecting tray, this is actually the aqueous humor, which this is found in the anterior segment. The pressure from these two types of fluid actually help to, again, maintain the shape of the eye, but if the pressure becomes too high, it can lead to an eye disorder called glaucoma. And I also mentioned this lens, that the flexibility of the lens is what allows us to see things up close. And as you age, the flexibility of the lens gets worse, and it can lead to presbyopia. And I'm going to kind of move this guy to the side. When we look at both halves, actually, let's just focus on one of them. We still have a little bit connecting them. So let's focus on the anterior segment. So there is this rectangle shaped hole in the middle of the anterior segment. This is actually the pupil. The pupil is just an opening. It is controlled by the muscle that encompasses it most closely. This is the iris, and the iris is responsible for constricting that pupil or dilating that pupil, and it almost acts like a sphincter, where when it constricts, those muscles can also contract and they shrink the pupil, and then the longitudinal muscles will help with dilation. Now, you can also see that there are, it's almost like spokes. I'm going to try to bring this closer so you can see it. That it reminds me of a bike wheel with the spokes going towards the middle, but that is indicating the ciliary muscle, right? Now, the dark color that you're seeing on both the anterior and posterior sections I have, this is part of the vascular tunic, and that dark color, when it continues to the posterior portion of the eye, that is called choroid. The dark color actually helps to absorb the extra light that enters the eye that isn't actually used by the retina. So before we get into that choroid anymore, I want to make sure that you can see this sort of beige tissue that looks a little bit wrinkled. This is part of the inner tunic referred to as the neural tunic, and this is where the photoreceptors are found. Now, the photoreceptors are rods and cones. Cones help with color vision, rods help with night vision, and there are a lot of densely packed cones in an area called the fovea centralis, which that would line up directly with the pupil. But just medial to that, there's kind of this little dimple that develops, and this is because of all of the axons of the photoreceptors start to come together and they go out the optic nerve. And in this spot, there are no actual receptors. It's just the axons of the receptors. This is referred to as the optic disc, but it's also the blind spot. You're not able to see anything if it lands on that part of your retina. Now, if I start to use my probe to pull that retina off, you can see the exposed black material behind it. And actually where the retina is still connected as I'm doing this is telling me that that is where the optic nerve is, and it is right there. So the black portion is the choroid. Again, that is part of the vascular tunic. So the black part is the choroid, and that is part of the vascular tunic. That's where the blood vessels are traveling. But this dark pigment is helping to absorb any extra light that is coming into the eye. Now, animals that are nocturnal will have this shiny portion to it. If you've ever pulled into a driveway before and your headlights are on and you see a cat or you see a deer, you have this glowing that's coming back at you, and it's this particular portion of that tunic. This is called the tapetum lucidum. Think tapestry of light. It always reminds me of kind of like an abalone shell, but this is reflecting light back into the eye to try to help with animals that are more active at night.